Incendiary television ads, racially insensitive remarks, and Illinois Nazis? It's primary election season, and we'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Hello and welcome to Capitol View. I'm Brian Mackey, State House reporter for Illinois Public Radio. With me this week is Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield and a longtime State House correspondent, and Mark Maxwell, Capitol Bureau Chief for WCIA Television. It's the CBS station broadcasting in Springfield, Decatur, and Champaign. Mark, Charlie, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with candidate J.B. Pritzker. This is the billionaire heir, the businessman, heir to the Hyatt Hotel fortune. He has a long history as a sort of fundraiser in Illinois politics. He had an association with former Governor Rod Blagojevich, and apparently he liked to talk on the phone to the former governor, at least did talk on the phone with the former governor. Mark, what's the latest? The Chicago Tribune is out with a story that kind of dropped like a bomb in the campaign this week.
A bomb is right, and the shockwaves of it are reverberating throughout the State House this week. The Pritzker surrogates are either in hiding or they are sticking very carefully to script. There are not many people coming to a full-throated defense of the remarks. In fact, J.B. Pritzker himself apologizing on, I believe, Wednesday of this week and saying that he wasn't his best self in that phone call in which he referred to then Senate President Emil Jones as crass and said you can, if you're forced to put an African-American in President Barack Obama's Senate seat, well, maybe Jesse White is a less offensive pick. And so those unvarnished remarks really pulled back the curtain. The Pritzker campaign says, look, anybody caught on a private recording is probably going to have a few disappointing moments. But this is just one of those things that can really threaten to damage any, especially a Democratic primary campaign right about now. It's going to be difficult to overcome that. And they are in full damage control mode right now.
Yeah, you mentioned pulling back the curtain. Mary Mitchell, who's an African-American columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, she wrote, that he can apologize all he wants, but he got busted, right? She said that this is how black people fear that white people talk about them all the time when they're not in the room, especially powerful politicians. Charlie, this is the second time we've heard a Blagojevich wiretap recording. I wonder, what do you think? Was it normal for people to be on the phone with Blagojevich even as the feds were apparently closing in on him back in late 2008?
Well, he had a reputation for being quite a talker, and he, in the tapes that were released as part of his trial, he was talking to a lot of people about a lot of different subjects, and a lot of it was the kind of thing that you would not want to be made public, obviously, and a lot of it is political speculation. And the fact is that racial politics is a reality in Illinois, and particularly in Chicago, and it's not just based on one's skin color, it's based on ethnicity too. For many years there were certain judgeships that were considered Jewish judgeships, or Polish judgeships, or Italian judgeships, and people would be slated for those positions based on their ethnicity. There were certain positions that were considered to be African-American positions. So that's been a reality for a long time. Usually those kinds of comments don't come out in public. They're more a private conversation. And one of the questions, or a couple questions I have, one is, what else might there be that will be leaked later on? And how did these leaks come about? I know one of the things that Patty Blagojevich, Rod's wife, has said, if the feds would release all the conversations they tape, they'd see that the ones they cherry-picked to send my husband away were just part of an overall political, what's the correct word? That's not
witch hunt or something?
Yeah, just political chit-chat, for want of a better term.
I see what you're
But there's a real privacy concern. The other people that are on those calls swept up in that dragnet, they would probably have legal standing to challenge the release subject of that surveillance.
I don't know if, I'm not a lawyer obviously, but the ability to tape people without their knowledge is kind of wide open these days in Illinois. after the eavesdropping law, which required consent of the parties, was struck down some years back.
Well, and certainly then the FBI would have had a warrant. I mean, they had a warrant for this,
Oh, for
these
Blagojevich,
recordings.
sure.
Yeah, and so, I mean, who gets caught up in that? And the judge, I mean, you raise a point, Mark. The judge did put it under seal. These recordings are not supposed to be out, as Charlie said. So who would be leaking this? You know, and we heard Pritzker this week talk about collusion between the Rauner campaign and the Pritzker, or excuse me, and the Chicago Tribune. But I mean, you have to remember that the Tribune reporter who had bylines on both of these articles about the wiretaps literally wrote a book on the Blagojevich campaign and was known to have really good federal sources. I think that they even broke the story about Blagojevich being wiretapped before he was arrested.
And this, he maintains, he was accused by the Pritzker campaign of colluding with the Rauner campaign back in May when the first wave of tapes came out, and came to his own defense and said, hey, I cultivated this source back in 2006. That's long before Bruce Rauner's name was ever a political item in Illinois. And so he maintains that he has a source and will protect that source. But there are other questions about how long the Tribune had these explosive recordings, and did they choose to publish them? There might be a journalistic debate about how long you would hold on to something like that if it's important information. I think back to the Access Hollywood tapes where NBC had these explosive recordings about Donald Trump and did not release them during a primary but waited until a general. And in conservative wings, that was a big explosive thing because they said, look, we might have made a different decision in the primary if had we known. So there's real questions about how long places hold on to stuff, but it's up to them.
See, my guess would be, and let me begin with a disclaimer. I worked for 24 years for the Chicago Sun-Times, which is the Chicago Tribune's big rival. And so we fought tooth and nail over these kinds of stories for, as I say, like a quarter century. I don't believe that the Tribune reporter would have sat on this once he got it. As soon as it was in his lap, he'd do the story. He'd do the research and the interviews and everything that was needed to flesh out the story, but he'd go with it right away. Any reporter would. You wouldn't worry about the political thing, and you wouldn't be trying to sit on stuff to try and damage somebody's candidacy. On the other hand, the ultimate source might have been thinking, when will the release of these recordings do the most damage to J.B. Pritzker?
Yeah, and so, I mean, as we just, I should say, this is speculation here, as we're wondering, but who are the possible sources? The FBI, federal prosecutors, the defense attorneys presumably would have had access to these things.
Sure.
You know, maybe even Patty Blagojevich, right? I mean, through her
Cast of
attorney. Who knows?
thousands, you might
right.
say.
So, I mean, you know, at this point, it's just speculation as to who would have released this and what their motives were. But the damage is real, and as you pointed out, Mark, he apologized, and so far it seems like a lot of the prominent African American voices in Illinois politics who endorsed him are sticking with him.
But they're the only people who are coming to his defense are those whose political futures are tied in with his. Those people who have already made endorsements, who have already come forward, some who have received donations. So I have not yet seen, and there could be out there somewhere, but somebody who has not already been tied in with his campaign come forward and say, I didn't really see anything wrong with that. So there is a galvanizing of the party, of the different campaigns in this primary, and it's going to be more bitter before the Democratic Party comes back together in this. If I can just,
I would add to that,
Yeah.
though. Pritzker's apology was accepted, I believe, by Jesse White, who is one of the main characters in this drama. And White is somebody he may be the most popular elected official in the state of Illinois.
He gets non-democratic margins in our Democrat, it's 70% of the vote routinely.
No, and it has nothing to do with his, the color of his skin. It has to do with the quality of his services. It has to do with the character of Jesse White. He started out in the General Assembly as a freshman legislator back in the early 70s, and he's always been a total gentleman. He's always been somebody who was fighting for what I considered good causes, fighting for the people who lived in Cabrini Green on the Human Rights Commission or Committee in the House, the work he's done against drunk driving, impaired driving. No, so it's not that you can look at Jesse White and say that, he's got to suck up to J.B. Pritzker.
but you can also add other context to it and go back and look and see that White was Pritzker's first big endorsement in this race. White was somebody who was close enough to Pritzker that in 2008, Pritzker would lift his name up as a Senate candidate for the U.S. Senate. And in that phone call, Pritzker was familiar enough with the power of the Secretary of State to say, that's the office that has the power of jobs. Why not remove him and put somebody there that you can use as an ally?
Yeah,
So
but
those,
I would discount that. Anybody in Illinois politics knows that the Secretary of State controls the second most jobs after the governor by a wide margin. So, as I say, I think Jesse White stands tall in all of this.
And one person who is criticizing Pritzker, though, is Emil Jones, who has aligned himself with Chris Kennedy's campaign, one of the other people. Chris Kennedy did not waste any time in saying that, sort of criticizing Pritzker for his remarks, as did his one of the other opponents, Daniel Biss. But Emil Jones called Pritzker a one-eyed Jack. But of course, Emil Jones kind of got the worst of it. He was described as not Senate material and being crass. Or a sort of crass was the term that Pritzker went with in this recording. So I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess, if there's if this is really going to harm the candidate.
And I would say for many years people underestimated Emil Jones.
Sure.
Part of it, he doesn't speak like an Oxford graduate, but he's a very.
You might almost say
guy.
he has like an impediment or so. I mean, he definitely in a very deep, gravelly voice. It can be you have to lean in.
But he's a very intelligent guy. He's
Sure.
very much up on public policy, and he was another guy I first met when he was a freshman legislator in the Illinois House. I think that he always felt he was disrespected when he was the Senate Minority Leader during the time that the Senate was controlled by Republicans, and the president was James Pate Phillip, a suburban Republican who was a very conservative guy. And the press would go, myself included, when we wanted to get the Democratic take on things, we go and talk to Mike Madigan, who was the House Speaker. And we kind of ignore Emil. And the thinking was Madigan can actually make something happen because he's the leader, so we sort of ignored him. And I think that bothered Emil. But he is a very, very sharp guy. And he's another guy who really sticks up for his constituents, for the little people.
Yeah, I had this experience once, and I guess the question is, does his denouncing of Pritzker carry more weight than Jesse White's standing by Pritzker in this? I had an experience. I was in the Marshall Fields in downtown Chicago once, and I happened to see Emil Jones. He was still Senate. He was either still Senate president or had just stepped down as Senate president, and he was just in civilian clothing. He wasn't wearing a suit or anything, but just I was stunned at the number of people who just kept coming up to him and shaking his hand and saying hello. And I mean, he's even though he's out of politics now though for 10 years, so I'm not sure. The question is, how much weight does his denunciation carry in this primary in Chicago?
Another question looking forward is how long until Emil Jones's words are used in a Bruce Rauner television ad, because those words could come back to haunt J.B. Pritzker if this becomes general election fodder. So, and we've already seen these FBI wiretaps included in these ads, and the question is, when do they pull the trigger? I'm sure the editors are already queuing up that in their edit bays.
Yeah, I would say, what do they say? 3, 2, 1.
Right.
Here it is.
Yeah. The governor has certainly tried to make a lot of hay of this. Well, this is speaking of ads in the Republican primary. There were a couple more that we should talk about this week. The first one came after last week's show was taped, but it did come at the end of last week, and this is from Republican primary candidate Jeannie Ives, who's a state representative from the Chicago suburbs, and it's drawing a lot of heat. It starts out with a group of people, sort of actors purporting to be, stereotypical liberals. And in this script, there's a man with a sort of a burly man wearing a woman's dress, and he says,
5 o'clock shadow.
Yeah, 5 o'clock shadow. Thank you, Bruce Rauner, for letting me use the girls' bathroom. And there's a young woman who says, thank you, Governor Rauner, for making all Illinois taxpayers pay for my abortions. And this is, it was an attempt to be satirical, but as the Chicago Tribune editorial board pointed out, Charlie, this was, in their view at least, punching down, right? People who are sort of traditionally marginalized in our political sphere. But I mean, she's drawing a lot of heat for this.
Yeah, although I would say, stepping aside from any, what would you say, civil or moral or ethical judgments, it was a brilliant ad, and it accomplished exactly what she wanted. She hasn't gotten much attention. She doesn't have millions upon millions of dollars that she can throw out in advertising the way the governor has. So she's got to get the media to pay attention. Outrageous, a despicable commercial like that. Here we are, we're talking about
Yeah.
it. Everybody's talking about it. So there's an old saying, and I forget who it's attributed to, but I've had it said to me several times, I don't care what you say about me as long as you spell my name right. So getting it out there, it's worth millions and millions of dollars in free advertising for, I would say.
Well, and they're not even hiding that was the strategy. In fact, they're chest thumping, saying this was manufactured outrage. This was done with a calculated intention that they would get media shock and awe, and the hyperventilating press would point and say, look, that's offensive. That was part of their calculation going into this, because they did think that they would align themselves with the Steve Bannon or Donald Trump playbook to just agitate what they've called the liberal media in their social media posts. I look, though to Ives supporters, conservative Republicans like Representative Peter Breen, who with the Thomas More Society, a very pro-life group. He said the ad was divisive and unnecessary. It didn't advance debate. A fiscal hawk in David McSweeney from Barrington Hills, another Republican, and an Ives supporter, said that this is there's no need to use satire to describe groups that you mentioned. So her own closest inner circle has called for her to take the ad off the air. She hasn't listened to them. And they've said that on the context, it was inappropriate. But we can look a step further beyond whether or not people should be offended. I found that people at home are pretty good at figuring out what offends them, and I don't really need to be the referee there of that advertisement and tell you that nothing in House Bill 1785 that Governor Rauner signed has anything to do with transgender bathroom access. It's a 53-year-old law that already allowed transgender individuals to alter their birth certificate. This changed the medical language around that, and there's simply nothing to do with bathroom access in that. So they were hoping everybody would point at the insensitive context and ignore or fail to refute the false content.
Yeah,
and that's a very dangerous tactic.
That's a good
Although
point. Because
I would say that if you were to look carefully at just about anybody's ads, they're mostly all false content if you think about it. Truth is not one of the virtues that are pursued when you put together these kinds of ads.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. And I've seen some real doozies both in mail.
But you're also true that the characterization totally is false with what the legislation actually did.
And the House Bill 40, the abortion legislation that's referenced, has not yet paid for a single abortion because there's a court challenge, in part being argued by Peter Breen, the state representative and anti-abortion lawyer you had mentioned earlier. But for all the attention, and Charlie, you said, well, she hasn't had millions of dollars, but she's actually starting to collect millions of dollars from an individual named Dick Uihlein. He's one of the big Republican donors in Illinois. You may have seen his name on a cardboard box. You got to look on the bottom of the cardboard box. Uihlein, and that's the company. They make packing tape, cardboard boxes, things like that. He's a very rich man. He used to be aligned with Governor Bruce Rauner. Famously, when Governor Rauner dumped or gathered about $20 million in his bank account just after he won the election, and that raised a lot of eyebrows. Uihlein was one of the people who helped him fill that pot of money, but now he's supporting Jeannie Ives, and that seems to have gotten the governor's attention because barely even mentioning Ives' name in the campaign until now, he's running an ad against Representative Ives.
Yeah, there is right now a fractured Republican Party in Illinois. It used to be that candidates like, even on the national scale, I think this is true, candidates like Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney were seen as the best chance of winning in blue states like Illinois or Massachusetts or wherever you go. And even in Florida, a swing state there where Jeb Bush was. Bruce Rauner fits into that vein. But after 2016, a lot of Republicans are rethinking how bold they can be, how energized and how far they can go. Jeannie Ives represents that, and she has so far won not only the donor, Dick Uihlein, but a top fundraiser in John Tillman with the Illinois Policy Institute, who is aligning himself more and more with Jeannie Ives' campaign. So, but there's two schools of thought there. There's the Ives school of thought, the Rauner camp, and those who may not come publicly to his defense right now. Behind closed doors, they say, you know what? Jeannie Ives is succeeding in the game that Mike Madigan planted with the HB 40 and with some of these other controversial social bills that weren't sent to the governor's desk until right before an election year. And one person described it to me as Mike Madigan laid a social conservatives minefield out there, and that Jeannie Ives is running up to it and just shaking it and threatening to divide the Republican Party in two. Another person very close to the drafting of HB 40, while that's a very serious issue on its own, a Democrat was pleased to see the Republican Party fracturing like it is, saying that somebody should teach Jeannie Ives what it means to divide and conquer, and that the political side of this is working out just as Democrats had planned.
Well, Charlie, it's not a new story in
is,
Illinois. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add, you could also look at it as, in a sense, being in Bruce Rauner's favor, because he is not going to be beaten by Jeannie Ives. I would be totally flabbergasted should that occur.
We heard it here first.
Yeah. And as a candidate, he will be able to present himself as a moderate, saying, yes, I did these things, and I represent the progressive wing, if you will, of the Republican Party. And in a state like Illinois, those kind of issues are going to play better in the area where most of the votes are, namely the suburbs, than being a hard right conservative, which plays well maybe in southern Illinois, but unfortunately that's not where the people live.
And this has been the governor's strategy all along, right? To sort of say, I don't have a social agenda, I don't want to worry about these issues, I just want to think about my economic, labor issues, things like that. But Charlie, it's an old story in Illinois that the social conservatives, the people who want more purity of ideological thinking on the Republican side, are going against the sort of corporatist, businessman chamber of commerce type Republicans. I mean, we've been seeing that battle play out for a long time now.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. So, the ad, interestingly, that the governor is running tries to tie Jeannie Ives to House Speaker Michael Madigan, which is a bit of a head scratcher, but I guess because she is an arch conservative, she is not afraid. I mean, she is a principled person. She's not afraid to be on the small side of a bill that passes with a 100-8 margin or something like that. I mean, she does vote her principles, but she is about as far from a liberal as you can get in the Illinois General Assembly. But it'll be interesting to see what's happening there as this plays out. One other interesting bit of campaign news we learned about this week, the Chicago Sun-Times broke a story that there's a man who is essentially a Nazi who is seems like he's got a pretty clear path to clinching a Republican nomination to be a candidate for the United States Congress. And this is another example of something that's happening in Illinois politics that's making national news this week. Charlie, this guy is a bit of a perennial candidate, isn't he? He's run before.
Yeah, and it's, in a sense, I would lay it on the Republican leadership for not making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, not putting somebody up. Yeah, the chances of Republicans winning that district are pretty slim. And so what you do is you get some responsible candidate or some candidate that doesn't have 30 tons of baggage and say, you take one for the team, you go out there, run this race, you're going to lose, but at least we'll have a presence in the district that we can be proud of. Now they're trying to figure out ways, how can we finesse things to block this guy from getting the nomination? It's too late to put somebody else in to challenge him. It's too late to challenge his petitions. It's too late to file as a write-in candidate in that district. So unless the good Lord Almighty intervenes, Arthur Jones will be the Republican candidate for Congress in that district. Now he'll get creamed in the general, but still I think it's an embarrassment to the Republicans. As I say, it looks like the leadership just wasn't paying attention.
Yeah,
and it's happened to the Democrats. The Democrats years ago lost primaries to two followers of Lyndon LaRouche.
Right. You'd think that people would learn their lesson here in Illinois, but in their defense, the state Republican Party, did apparently looked at his petition signatures, but he actually. And they were able to knock him off in 2016 for that. But this year he actually took his time, Arthur Jones did, and dotted his own I's and crossed his T's, and so was able to get on the ballot. And the bit of remaining time we have, Charlie, just a couple of highlights of the budget. The governor's budget address is next week. What are you listening for? I mean, the governor we heard from his budget office, we should say this week, that the current year deficit is now down to about $600 million, which is quite an improvement from what we thought it would be, and that's thanks to better than expected tax revenues. And the governor's going to be asking for a $1.1 billion supplemental appropriation bill for this year. What are you going to be listening for? What should we be listening for?
The thing that I'm going to be most intrigued for is what kind of legerdemain he proposes to be able to come up with a balanced budget, which again I think is not possible for FY19, and also to reduce the taxes. I mean, if he can do that, you know, God love him. He could put a man on Mars just by saying it.
Mark, are you going to be thinking about anything in particular as we're going into the budget address?
Well, the $600 million number you said is a lot easier to bridge that gap than the $1.7 billion that we had previously heard. So the governor's budget director has been hard at work, and I think that I'm looking to see if this governor will increase the level of school funding in the new formula over and above that $350 million in new money, or if that will hold steady. So there will be a ebb and flow of which projects get new money and where cuts may occur, but that will be an interesting thing to watch.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. That's going to be our cliffhanger ending. You'll have to tune in next week to learn, did Governor Rauner solve all the financial problems of Illinois in his FY19 budget address? Thanks to Mark Maxwell of WCIA Television. He's the Capitol Bureau Chief there, and Charlie Wheeler of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. I'm Brian Mackey.